Hi guys, my name is Sarah Zubair. I am a previous debater for Colombo International School. Today I will be debriefing the Vijis 2026 motion, which states, "This House supports narratives that diversity is instrumentally valuable rather than morally right." I want to make a clarification at the top of this debrief. Both sides argue about the fact that diversity is something good and therefore should be sustained within society. The nuance in this debate then becomes which narrative is being used to promote things such as diversity. On proposition, your case in a nutshell would be like, we should tell people that diversity is valuable because of the outcomes it produces, i.e., you take a utilitarian stance. Whereas in opposition, you say, we should tell people that diversity is the right thing to do regardless of the outcome, i.e., a morally obligatory stance. Let's delve into the proposition case. In terms of setup and framing, particularly in terms of characterization, you state that you are not arguing that diversity is solely instrumentally valuable, nor are you arguing that it is morally completely irrelevant. You argue that the dominant public narrative should justify diversity primarily through its practical benefits rather than things such as moral obligation. This would look like diverse teams make better decisions, diversity increases things such as innovation, or representation in agencies such as the government would improve policy making, instead of saying things that you owe diversity to society because of the presence of marginalized groups and because it is the morally right thing to do. So this debate ultimately boils down to which narrative better advances diversity in the real world. In terms of framing, you should say that this debate should be judged on which narrative is much more effective at increasing and sustaining genuine diversity. Since this is a narrative motion, knowing how the effectivity of narratives are judged in this case would be if it persuades more people, secondly, if it would survive things such as political backlash, thirdly, if it creates a durable and very strong institutional support, and fourthly, if it results in better outcomes for marginalized groups, because at the end of the day, they are the minority we are talking about within this debate. In terms of arguments, the first argument you'd state is that instrumental narratives persuade a broader audience. The claim you are making here is that instrumental narratives convince people who would reject moral arguments. For example, when we take things such as faith, a lot of people do not believe in religion because they do not see the outcomes of religion in a tangible manner right in front of them. For people like that, instrumental narratives work perfectly because moral narratives already assume that people share the same values of justice and equality. It assumes that people are all sympathetic to the same level in regards to things such as racism or in regards to things that destroy diversity. But in reality, when we look at it, societies are politically polarized. A lot of people do reject historical responsibility. For example, some people do not believe in things such as black prejudice in countries such as the US, and many people resent being told things that are morally obligated. It is like if you were a little kid and you were told to respect an elder that you didn't like, but you were obligated to do so because of traditions and cultures that existed within society. At the end of the day, it just created much more resentment in you as a child. So when diversity is framed as something that is economically or institutionally beneficial, people are more inclined to support it without first accepting a particularly moral window that opposition tries to mention. For instance, businesses support diverse hiring because of the fact that profits improve. That is an economic outcome. Militaries diversify because of the fact that operational effectiveness increases. And governments diversify because as a result of diversifying, policy making obviously improves. So people cooperate despite those ideological differences because everyone can see tangible benefits. On opposition, you only persuade people that are already sympathetic towards things that destroy diversity. Whereas on proposition, you reach both supporters as well as people that are skeptical because you are keeping a tangible benefit right there for them to believe. The impact of this argument is that you have greater public buy-in, which means that institutions are able to support you much more because you've convinced far greater institutions. Secondly, is that you receive less backlash for the ideology you are trying to propagate within society, which in this case is diversity. And thirdly, is that diversity can be a much more long-term thing because of the fact that it is sustainable the more you try and convince people. The second argument that you'd say is that instrumental narratives reduce identity backlash or the political polarization that already exists within society. Polarization, in a very simple manner, just means that society has very different ideologies that are extreme to each other. So some people might be extremely supportive of having diversity being a very prevalent thing within society, whereas some people might be ultimately racist at the point where they support like narratives such as white supremacism, etc., etc. Within the second argument, your claim is that people resist diversity when they believe it is being imposed as a moral judgment. This is the similar example I gave to you, where you are told by your parents to respect certain elders even if you do not like those elders, solely because of the fact that it is morally obligated within society for you to do so. The mechanism here is that moral narratives often imply that if you disagree, you are prejudiced. Even though you are not physically prejudiced, you might be mentally prejudiced in the way that people look down on you. Or supporting diversity is a measure of whether you are a good or bad person. So if you do not support principles such as diversity, you are considered a bad person within society. This creates defensiveness within individuals, and ultimately, because of this built-up resentment, people stop discussing policy and rather they start defending their moral identity, and they try justifying either supporting diversity or not supporting diversity. Whereas instrumental narratives, it changes the window of conversation from, oh, you're morally wrong, to this makes our workplace, university, or government perform better, i.e. it creates efficiency within these environments. So this shifts the window of disagreement into a much more practical discussion, where it just makes things such as compromise far greater and far easier within society. The comparative here is that OP tries to win this sort of argument, and OP tries to convince people that diversity is something that should be propagated through things such as guilt or moral pressure, whereas on proposition, you are creating shared and joint interests which persuade people to buy into the narrative of diversity. The impact of this is that there is less polarization overall. You are unlikely to create either ends of the spectrum in terms of extremist ideologies, which means that you have fewer things such as cultural wars, you have much more stable policies in relation to diversity, and you have greater cooperation within minority groups as well. That is proposition's case for you. Let's look at opposition's case on the other hand. What do we say in terms of setup? You say that, sure, diversity has its practical benefits, but it is only utilitarian to a certain extent. You say that those benefits cannot be the primary narrative in which diversity is communicated to society. You'd say that you oppose reducing diversity to a tool for improving productivity or efficiency, and people deserve inclusion because of the fact that they possess equal dignity and equal rights, not because of the fact that they generate values for others. In a nutshell, you'd say that we should not respect people, or diversity should not be a reward because people are generating value for themselves. So diversity is not something that should be earned, or inclusivity is not something that should be earned. Rather, it is something that should just purely exist within society. In terms of framing, you'd say that this debate is about what society should normalize, rather than a narrative that you are just trying to build up and have much more buy-in like you pushed in proposition. So you'd say a good narrative should probably recognize people's intrinsic worth. Secondly, protect minorities even when things such as diversity is inconvenient. Even when things such as representation become something inconvenient in a workplace, diversity should still be something that is normalized. Like, you should be able to have a team in a project full of brown people and white people all combined, rather than go along the lines of white supremacy because it is convenient for a company or in terms of other workplaces such as universities. Thirdly, is that you avoid making rights such as diversity and inclusivity on conditional bases or in terms of usefulness. The first argument you make is that moral rights and principles should never depend on utility. The claim here is that instrumental narratives make things such as inclusion conditional. The mechanism is that if diversity is justified because it improves performance, then what happens if it does not improve performance? So proposition ideally goes on a lot of assumptions. They say that, look, diversity is only important because of the fact that it improves this, it improves efficiency, but you are working on all assumptions, and i.e. you are working on conditions. On opposition, you basically challenge those assumptions. You say that what happens when evidence is something that becomes mixed, when diversity becomes something that is expensive, when inclusion temporarily reduces efficiency because of people of different backgrounds, different cultures, different educational backgrounds. What if a homogeneous team performs better in a certain context, such as a project, when it comes to a workplace? So it is the same logic that basically justified diversity that is actively using it to exclude people. And this is a very smart argument to run in opposition, because you are challenging all the assumptions that utilitarian mechanisms that proposition is trying to claim. Unless a proposition team is very strong and can sort of flip these mechanisms or flip these claims that opposition is trying to make, there is not a very good way of proposition winning the debate. Then you say that moral narratives avoid these things. But obviously on proposition you'd say moral narratives at the end of the day assume that people are all sympathetic. So it is a very interesting debate to argue on. It just depends on how good the teams are and how nuanced the arguments are. So on opposition, at the end of the argument you say every person deserves equal opportunity regardless of if others benefit or not. The comparative on proposition is that proposition's framework only protects diversity when it remains useful and when it remains practical for them. Whereas on opposition, you are creating a standstill mechanism of protecting diversity permanently. The impact of this is that it creates much more stronger and much more principled protection for people in marginalized communities. The second argument you state is that instrumental narratives commodify marginalized people. The claim you are trying to make is that people become valued only for what they contribute rather than who they actually are. So you might be valued as a Latin American within a US firm because of you probably being smarter, or you as a Chinese person would be much more likely to be hired because Chinese people are known to be much more smarter globally rather than people of like white origin. The mechanism in this argument is that you say employees are hired because they quote unquote bring in different perspectives, or students are admitted because they improve classroom discussion. Minorities only become resources for things such as organizational access. Whereas moral narratives affirm that you belong within those environments regardless of the outcome. You belong because of the fact that you are an equal human being, and you principally you have the right to belong in that certain environment. So representation as a result is a matter of justice, not a matter of productivity or efficiency. On the comparative, proposition only values diversity for places like institutions, whereas opposition values people themselves for who they are, and it does not create this identity backlash that proposition otherwise would create. The impact of this is that you create genuine belonging rather than being very transactional. This debate at the end of the day then boils down to one central question. On proposition, it is the best narrative is the one that convinces the most people and creates the most practical and long-lasting support for diversity. Whereas on opposition, you say that the best narrative is the one that protects equality even when diversity is unpopular or no longer seen as beneficial. This debate can come off as very confusing to a lot of novice teams or debaters who do not have a lot of experience because of the fact that it is a narrative motion combined with principles, ethics, and morals. At the end of the day, if you are able to prove to your adjudicator, and if you are able to persuade your adjudicator as to say that your narrative or your side's narrative propagates much more inclination to people in society to believe things such as diversity and creates less separation when it comes to things such as diversity, i.e. creates more shared interest, then automatically you win the debate. I hope this debrief was clear. Thank you for listening to me so far.